I'm very pleased to rise in the House today to talk about something that is negatively affecting many Ontarians, including those in my riding of Hastings-Lennox and Addington. And that, Speaker, is the carbon tax. This poorly thought out tax grab by the federal government is doubling down on the existing pain already caused by the inflationary spirals and the interest rate hikes that are causing so much concern, so much suffering amongst struggling families. People should simply not have to choose between heating and eating. Housing cost is more because interest rates are up. Fuel costs have gone up because of many things around the global economy, certainly. And adding a tax, adding more tax to the already increased home heating fuel cost is just adding to all the cost increases. The cost of living increases are bad enough, but adding a tax to that is rubbing salt in the wound. Ultimately, it's punitive. There is no option in Ontario. You have to heat your home in the winter. The idea that a carbon tax will convince you somehow to use less fuel is saying that we actually want people to poorly heat their homes. This is ludicrous. Speaker, the last couple of years has changed something for Ontarians. There is a very simple and practical element of what should be an everyday occurrence in life across this province. That is the enjoyable trip to the grocery store. Right? Gone are the days when families would gather together and go to the local supermarket and actually get excited to pick out the foods that they're going to eat over the next week or so, to prepare those meals for the week. Now families have to brace themselves for making hard decisions of what to feed their families. Very often, unfortunately, deciding between heating their homes and eating good, nutritious foods. The motion we're discussing today proposes that the Liberal federal government remove this carbon tax from those home heating fuels. The motion is limited to fuels, and I will get to that, Speaker, but I would be remiss if I didn't point out that most of the world views carbon taxes as completely ineffective. In fact, 75% of the nations of this world don't have a carbon tax, including some of those that are recognized or at least have reputations as being the leading champions in the climate change effort. Countries like Australia, New Zealand, and Germany don't require their citizens to pay this wholly ineffective tax. Speaker, as families head out to pick up their groceries, they're constantly hit with the carbon tax. It starts with putting fuel in their vehicles just to travel to the store. And Speaker, I do need to mention the geography. The area in which you live should never be a determination as to how much excessive tax you pay. For the vast majority of people in my riding, there is no local public transit. For very small rural municipalities, transit's just not a reasonable or practical option for them. So for my residents, a vehicle is not a luxury, it's a necessity. But when you live in small towns and rural areas in the north or the south of this province, you must have access to a car, which means you must buy gasoline, right? Which means that with every kilometre traveled, you're paying that HST or that carbon tax. Right? The Canadian Taxpayer Federation estimates that with the current gas tax adding 14 cents per litre, skyrocketing over the next 6 years to the point where it will cost the average driver about $2,300 a year, almost $200 a month. That's a huge hit for struggling families. And Speaker, so far I've only talked about the struggles of Ontario families putting fuel in their vehicles. As they enter the grocery store, they're also seeing the cost of food inflated because of carbon tax and in some cases on those groceries, the HST. Before the food makes it to the store, we need to look at the farmers, the producers who are preparing our food. In producing and transporting the food that we eat, they too are feeling the burden of these taxes. Brendan Byrne, the chair of the Grain Farmers of Ontario, wrote in an article in the Hill Times. In it he says, like other Ontario grain farmers, we now have access to information and technology that helps us farm more efficiently than previous generation could ever have dreamed of. Agronomic science, data, and new innovations are allowing farmers to grow abundant, high-quality food on an ever-decreasing amounts of arable land. But some things don't change. Farmers know that healthy soil is the heart of a farm business, and we will do everything we can to protect it. The farmers are the experts on improving climate impact on their farms, and the federal carbon tax penalizes those farmers who are working hard to create greener farming. A little further in that article, Byrne states, when innovative ways to dry grain are developed, I can guarantee farmers will be quick to adopt them. Farm fuels are a major cost, and all farmers want to manage those costs. But until alternative solutions are available, taxing the fuels used for grain drying only penalizes farmers and unnecessarily increases the cost of food production. The Grain Farmers Association of Ontario have stated that by 2030, it is estimated that $2.7 billion worth of carbon tax will be paid by Ontario grain and oilseed farmers. The concept of providing an incentive for change that is only acting as like a penalty for farmers who have no alternatives to them, available to them, that is money coming right out of the farmers' pockets. Grain farmers across the country have been asking for a carbon tax exemption since the Federal Greenhouse Gas Pollution Pricing Act came into effect in 2018. The Act recognizes that farmers need to use some fuels to perform tasks, and the tax was removed for farmers for some gasoline and diesel. The use of propane and natural gas, however, does not have that exemption. Not surprisingly, Speaker, this tax is not applied equally, fairly, equitably, or even logically. Speaker, I reached out to one of my local farmers. Max Kaiser's an egg farmer down in southern Lennox and Addington. And for those in the House who don't know this, almost all farmers who raise animals for our food supply are also grain farmers. They have to be. They are growing the food that feed the animals that in turn provide our food. As was mentioned by Brendan Byrne, the federal government has decided that fuel costs for farmers, in some cases, are exempt from this exorbitant tax. But get this, while Max has his own drying equipment and does it himself, he's therefore exempted from some of those taxes. But his friend Richard, who doesn't own his own dryer, he sends his corn over to Herb to dry. Herb has to pay carbon tax because he's considered a commercial operator. So he passes that charge to Rich when he's drying Rich's corn. So Max's corn is dried tax-free, but Rich's isn't because of who's drying it. And I'll quote Max. He says, "Who uses it and for what is not relevant. Ultimately, it is all food. Why does it matter who's drying and who isn't?" Max goes on to say that he's buying about 55,000 liters of propane per year to dry his own corn. And if he was paying a carbon tax, there would be another $3,000 out of his pocket that has to be made up by the price of the food to the consumer. He also buys another 30,000 liters for heating his chick barns, on which there is about $2,000 worth of that tax. It's not exempt. These chicks need to be kept warm and alive so that they can in turn produce eggs. Because, I don't know about you, but I like eating eggs. As egg producers, they employ a cost of production pricing system, which means that those increases get reflected in the price they get paid for the eggs. So this is a price that gets passed on to consumers. Egg farmers collect about 66 cents for each dollar that the consumer pays for eggs. The grain and bread sectors only collect 2 or 3% on that consumer price. So let me quote Max again. So carbon taxing is far more impacting grocery prices for eggs and milk, but it all affects consumer pricing. And the federal government is lying if they say otherwise. Food and fuel are the bottom, the cornerstones of the economy, and food needs fuel to make it happen. According to the Canadian Energy Centre, Ontario agricultural production costs have increased 4% because of the carbon tax, and it continues with the HST. All of these costs are being passed along to families at the grocery store. And I must come back to the statement. As families across this province are struggling with food, they should not need to continually be deciding between heating and eating. And while there are good reasons to be concerned about policy implications with a heating oil exemption, the analysis has found, according to the Canadian Climate Institute, that the effect on emissions will be negligible. Even Enbridge estimated that the federal carbon charge will add almost $300 to the Ontario household natural gas bill. This is the home heating bill, and we know that there's HST on top of that. And this will only continue to increase year after year until 2030. The bottom line, the federal carbon tax, including the HST component, is not a balanced tax. The Canadian Federation of Independent Business says that $8 billion will be collected from small businesses and only $35 million returned, and that most businesses, 56%, will have no choice but to pass on those increased prices caused by the carbon tax and the HST to the consumers. We've all heard different estimates, but even the Bank of Canada itself says a major component of inflation right now are these taxes. And again, Speaker, I come back to the geography. Reports are very clear that while the vast majority of Eastern Canadians, Maritimers, are using furnace oil to heat their homes, but only 2 or 3% of Ontarians are. So most of us in this province are using the less carbon-intensive natural gas or propane. And yet the federal government has crassly decided to exempt the people of the Maritimes while ignoring the people of Ontario. Trust me, I don't begrudge the discount to the people of the Maritimes. They're suffering from bad federal policy on the economy as well. But I'm only asking to have that same exemption, the same recognition that we here in Ontario are suffering from the high costs and need these exemptions, the same exemptions that's being offered to Eastern Canada. And Speaker, that is exactly what the general motion, not including the amendment, is asking for, that in the opinion of this House, the Government of Canada should take immediate steps to eliminate the carbon tax on fuels and inputs for home heating. This is Canada. Home heating is a basic necessity. Adding to the costs of a basic necessity on top of all the increased costs for all the other necessities, including the HST, is just adding insult to injury. It's long been said that it's very expensive to be poor. If you can't afford to buy a new $7,000 or $10,000 high-efficiency furnace, then you're paying more for the same amount of fuel, with no improvement in your situation, but you are paying a higher level of tax. If you can't afford to buy the latest, most fuel-efficient car, then you're paying a higher level of tax. If you're struggling with your food budget, then you tend to buy smaller portions, and in turn, higher prices. If you can't afford to buy a local-made product, we know that right here in Ontario, right in all of our small communities, we grow some of the best food, we make some of the best products. But we also know that the stuff that's shipped in by freighter from other parts of the world sometimes is cheaper, and we end up resorting to that. So we're not feeding our own economy, and this tax is encouraging us to not feed our own economy. We need to continue to utilize our local suppliers, because those products coming from other parts of the world don't have the CO2 emissions controls that we have here. They don't have a carbon tax. They aren't suffering from this. Right? And finally, and maybe most importantly, it's well supported that struggling with affording heat, struggling with affording adequate shelter, struggling with affording good food and nutrition, these are basic elements of the socioeconomic factors of health. This carbon tax is adding to health challenges in this province, and it's adding to the cost of our healthcare system. Okay? So all of this adds up to, it's a horrible decision by the federal government. But I do have to mention that here in Ontario, we are helping. We are doing our best to improve the situation for Ontarians, to make the cost of living better. Our government, under this Premier, has been consistent. We want to support Ontarians and help them fight inflation and high interest rates. We fought this horrific carbon tax and continue to advocate to reduce or eliminate it. We lowered the cost of driving by lowering the gas tax and removing road tolls. We lowered taxation. In fact, in this province right now, if you don't make $50,000 in income, you don't pay any provincial income tax. This government, most importantly, has built up our economy, added 700,000 more jobs that are good-paying, high-wage jobs so that the residents of Ontario can better afford the cost of living. So yes, Speaker, this government, under the leadership of the Premier, is making life more affordable for Ontarians, and all the while, the federal Liberal government under Justin Trudeau is making it more expensive. So, Speaker, I'll end with a little analogy. Many people across this province here have savings. Many homeowners are saving for a future renovation or repair to the house. We know that at some point, the roof on a house will need to be replaced. So the homeowner begins to save money towards replacing that roof. However, life sometimes throws some different circumstances at that homeowner. They may need to change the amount that they're putting away each month in that savings, or even take a break from it so that they can afford the necessities of the day. The carbon tax is taking far more from the people than it's giving back. And are we actually saving money to help with the repair of the environment? And can we afford to save for tomorrow by starving or freezing today? No, that's not where Ontarians are at. Now is not the time for Ontarians to be putting money into the carbon tax while they struggle to make the decision between heating and eating. I urge all members to support this motion.